Hey, so just before I get into this video, I just want to mention that this guide is catered more towards the beginner or novice lifter, or anyone who's interested in getting into the gym for the first time, but are not sure where to start with those big compound movements. This is just going to be a collection of tips that I find aren't really covered in conventional how to squat videos. So let's just get right into it. So now we're just going to talk about determining which squat stance works best for you as an individual, um, in addition to how much external rotation or internal rotation you should have when you're squatting. And I'll show you what I mean here in a bit. So the first thing you're going to do to assess what type of squat style you should have is just lie on your floor, on your back, and you're going to bring your legs up into a straight up position like this with your knees bent. So if we were to rotate this picture here, it would look like we're in the bottom of a squat. We can see our hips are below parallel. And once your legs are up in this position, you're just going to let them fall out to the side. Like so. So in a slightly different position, filming top down, we can see what's happening here. So I'm just going to let this play again, and we're going to do the exact same thing. So legs up, and then let them fall to the side. So if I just pause it there, at that moment, once we let our legs fall out to the side, we can see that if we were again to look at this, if I were in a standing position, this would be a deep squat position for me. So, meaning, this is how much external rotation, or how far away our feet are pointed away from midline, and our abduction, how far away our legs have moved away from midline. So, this would be about the angle I would put my feet in, or my legs in, sorry, and this is the angle I put my feet in. So aside from the last test that we talked about, determining what type of style of squat you'll have, this is another test that will show you what type of hip you have, or it'll at least give you some good feedback as to where your squat stance should lie. So I'll just show this, again from top down. What we're going to do is we're going to raise our leg up, but instead of letting it fall to the side, what we're going to do is we're going to externally rotate. So you see all that external rotation I have. And again, this is keeping in mind that I have a deep hip socket. You'll see now that I have almost no internal rotation when we bring it back to midline. And then I'll just slow it down a little bit here. And now I'm going to do internal rotation. That's it. That is all the internal rotation I have. And then what you're going to do is, once you're done testing one leg, you're just going to drop it, and then you're going to raise up the other leg and compare. So again, I'll do external rotation first. We have a good amount of that. Then we're going to return back to neutral. And then we're going to do internal rotation. Again, a distinct lack of internal rotation due to the narrow or the deep hip sockets. So now that we know what a deep hip socket looks like with this test, I'll show you what a narrow hip socket looks like. You're going to notice a distinct lack of external rotation in this person versus the large amount of internal rotation that they have. Meaning this person would tend to excel at a narrow stance squat that's a lot more leg dominant than what I was demonstrating. So I'll just show you here. We'll go external rotation first, not a whole lot. Now internal rotation, quite a bit. So for this person in particular, taking a wide stance and sitting back could likely lead to hip pain and just plain inefficiency in the squat. So it's important to know what your hip structure is, because that'll dictate how you squat, and not only your squat, but also your deadlift. Okay, now we're going to cover creating a shelf for the bar in the context of a barbell squat. So what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to bring your shoulder blades together and down. What this is going to do, it's going to artificially create a shelf above the rear delts, which are our muscles on the back of the shoulder, about right here and here. That should make it a bit more comfortable for the bar to rest. So I'll show you without a bar, and then we'll progress to a bar. And then from there I'll show you ways that this can, or one big way that this can kind of be done wrong. So we're going to bring our arms up, squeeze our shoulder blades together, and then pull down. So what we're doing is we're directing force from our elbows together in towards midline, and our shoulder blades are going together and down. So in this position here, you can kind of see already the shelf that the bar is going to rest on. What we're going to do here is we're going to recreate that same position, but this time we have a bar on our back that will really show the resting position that it should end up in. So again, we're going to squeeze our shoulder blades together, and then from here we're going to drive down and together with our elbows and towards midline. And we're really trying to keep that shelf really solid. So the entire time you're squatting, if you've got the bar in this position, your shoulder blades should be together and down, and elbows should be nice and tight, as close as you can get them in towards midline. And for me, this is about it. But you can clearly see the resting position that the bar is in and what it's sitting on here on the back of the shoulders. So when you're trying to create a shelf for the bar using that technique that we just described, the biggest way I see it done incorrectly is in this example where we do the right steps, but instead of putting it on our rear delts, we slide it down so it's resting on the back of our arms. So in this position it would be pretty much impossible to stand completely straight up because the bar would just slide off our arms. Also in this position it creates a lot of unnecessary pressure in through the elbow, wrist, and shoulder. Just because it's not resting on anything, the arms will have to stay super far back and you'll have to lean super far over to keep it from falling off your back. So it's an easy fix. All you got to do is just roll yourself under the bar until it ends up resting comfortably onto the meat of the back of the shoulders there. So when we're learning to hip hinge to initiate a squat or a deadlift, the first place that I would start if you're a beginner is on the ground in all fours in a quadruped style of hip hinge. So I'm just going to let this play here, and you can see we're just sitting back in between our ankles. Now your arms and legs are going to be about shoulder width apart if you're trying this out. And that's pretty much the gist of it, is you're just going to start on all fours, shoulder width apart, then you're just going to sit back in between your ankles with your hips. Now the most important thing to do here is just to keep this neutral spine the entire time. We don't want your lower back rounding when you're doing this. Now once you have the quadruped hip hinge mastered, what we would do is we would go to a kneeling position and try this variation. So in this position, we're going to come up, keep the same width with your legs, but just put your arms where they're comfortable, and you're just going to sit back in between your ankles with your hips. So relatively simple, but it's a little bit more specific to a squat or a deadlift pattern where we're upright. So again, we're making sure to keep that spinal position nice and neutral. So the lower back in general actually doesn't change. So straight line, and straight line. Again, we don't want the lower back rounding. And that's about it for this version. Once we have the kneeling version of the hip hinge pattern done correctly, what we can do is we can go into a standing, but it's not going to be a freestanding hip hinge yet. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to position ourselves close to the wall, and the hip hinge here, we're going to be sitting back and trying to touch our butt off the wall behind us. So again, most important thing, keeping the lower back in general in a neutral position. Same position here as it is when we're standing. Now if you're doing this correctly, you're going to feel this a lot in the hamstring and glute area. Probably a little bit more in the hamstring because there's more of a stretch. Okay, so once we can touch our butt off the wall behind us in that third variation of the hip hinge with a neutral spine, then we can progress into a free hip hinge. So it's the exact same movement we've been practicing, except this is the end result. So if you're able to keep a neutral spine and hinge at the hips like this, again, you're going to feel it a lot in the hamstring area, possibly in the glute area as well. ideally both, but that's about it for the hip hinge pattern. Once you think you have a good grasp of the hip hinge, what we can do is we can test it. All you'll need is a stick like I have here in the video, or even if you have like a broomstick or just something, a straight line that will span the space from your head down to your glutes. And what we want to do, we're going to do a hip hinge with this touching the head, the upper back, and the glutes. We want to maintain those 3 points of contact. What we don't want is we do not want your lower back to touch it. So there should be a small space in between your lower back and the stick at all times. Likewise, it should remain in contact with those 3 points being, I'll mention again, head, upper back, and glutes. So I'll show you here. What we're doing is that hip hinge. As you can see, the head, upper back, and glutes are still in contact. And it's kind of hard to see here because of the baggy shirt, but I can guarantee that my lower back is not touching the stick here. Again, you're really going to feel this in the hamstring area and glute area. But the goal for this, maintain those 3 points of contact, and in doing so, it'll automatically keep you in a neutral spine. Just make sure that your lower back isn't touching the stick when you do this. So here's an example of what the hip hinge will look like if you're doing it wrong with that stick test that I just showed you. So again, we're going to go into a hip hinge pattern, and the person will still try to remain in contact with the head, upper back, and glutes, but we'll see what happens when things start to fall apart. So already, leaning forward at the lower back, we can see that the stick has now left the glutes, but is still in contact with the other two. So if we continue that pattern, we can see how bad this gets towards the end. I'll just bring this back to that point. So here we can see that the lower back is starting to round quite a bit. And if you initiate a squat like this, there's going to be a lot of external forces going into the lumbar spine because we're not really using our legs and our glutes, all of our strong hip and leg muscles to support the weight. Instead, it's going to be going mostly into the lower back here. So breathing is probably one of the most underrated things when it comes to large compound movements like the squat and the deadlift. So this is going to be a 3-step process. So the first step, you're going to put your hands in front of your abdomen like so, and we're going to breathe in and push our hands forward. You can see my stomach start to expand and push out against my hands. Step 2, you're going to place your hands on the sides of your stomach, pretty much across maybe a couple inches away from your belly button, and then you're going to do the exact same thing. You're going to breathe in and try to push the hands out to the side like you see there. So we're directing pressure in this video out into our hands from our belly while we breathe in. Step 3, you're going to place your hands directly on your sides, right below the rib cage there where your hands are. And when we breathe in, we're going to try and push our hands out to the side with the pressure that we create in our abdomen. So I'll show that here. Good. So now what we're going to do is we're going to recreate those 3 steps in one breath. So that means that we're going to be directing pressure forward, to the side, and directly out to the side and close to the back. So the way we're going to do this is just like before. Imagine you're pressing the hands forward, to the side, and directly out to the side. And once we have that breath, we're going to bear down almost if you were on the toilet or if you're trying to blow up a balloon. It doesn't need to be extremely intense, just enough that you feel a lot of pressure in through your abdominals. It looks very subtle, so I'm just going to play the video and you'll see what that looks like. So I'm taking my air in and then bearing down, and that's it. It's a very, very subtle movement. So again, what I'm doing here is I'm taking my air in, you can see that there, and then you can see that slight depression in the shirt when I try to bear down. Just watch right there. There. So right now, I'm feeling a lot of pressure in through my abdominals. And then I relax. Now, if we're doing it wrong, what you'll end up seeing is the chest and shoulders start to rise up, which means we're breathing into our accessory muscles and not so much the diaphragm. So this is what that looks like. So if we're in this position here, there is not a whole lot of pressure and bracing going on with the abdominals, which means that the lower back is prone for injury in this position if you're going to squat with this type of bracing. Now if we look from the side, what we're going to be seeing is another fault in the bracing pattern that we were going over, where the chest wall will start to rise up, but instead of expanding the abdominals, we're sucking in. Again, this is an incorrect version. Pressure should be going out, not in. One other underrated thing when it comes to squatting is rooting the feet into the ground. So what I mean by that is if you take a look at my feet here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to basically press my toes into the ground to create stability in the foot. Now I have pretty flat feet, as you can probably see from the video, but if I play this at a very slow speed, you'll be able to see my arch start to rise up when I start creating tension there. So here's the difference there versus no tension. So while we're squatting, we want to maintain that same level of tension the entire time. We're creating a solid base to be able to squat from. So you can see the difference there. The only thing I'm doing is pressing my toes into the ground. You almost want to think of your toes, or your feet in general, as a tripod. We want to maintain balance between our heel, our big toe, and our little toe at all times. This will help to create stability in the rest of the body and also help create a straight bar path, keeping the bar over the middle of the foot. Now we're going to put all those tips into practice with this squat here. So, as we can see, first of all, the bar is resting on top of the rear delts, so the back of the shoulder, that I'm creating by squeezing the shoulder blades together and down, while I'm also rooting the ground with my feet by pressing my toes into the ground. So right now we have a stable position, and the next step is going to be to brace. So you're going to see my stomach expand, and then once my stomach has enough air in it, I'm going to compress the trunk. So we'll see that. I'll just fast forward to that point. So right here, we can see the stomach expand forward, and I'm also creating pressure out through the sides. Right here. So right now at this point, I have air inside of my belly. And then after this happens, you're going to see my trunk compress to create tension through that air. Right there. So now, once we're in this position, we are ready to begin the descent of the squat. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to hip hinge by sitting our hips back. And as our hips start to drift back, our knees will go forward, which will create the appropriate amount of space in between the hip and the knee joint so that the bar can sit directly down. So we'll see that at slow motion here. Hips go back, knees go forward, bar drops straight down. So that was all of the tips put into practice. Hope that was helpful, and have fun squatting.